I am Robert Ashford. I am 68 years old, and I am finally learning to breathe again after the coldest betrayal of my life. For 42 years, I built Ashford Precision Machining from a single rented garage into a company that supplied parts to half the aerospace contractors on the East Coast. 2 months ago, at a dinner meant to celebrate my late wife's memory, my own son leaned across the table and told me I was an embarrassment to this family. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. The very next morning, I quietly moved every dollar he thought belonged to him, and then I vanished without a word. Before I go on, friend, let me ask you something. If your own child called you worthless to your face, would you forgive him, or would you make him understand exactly what he'd lost? Stay with me to the end of this one. It was a warm Thursday evening in early June, the kind of evening that used to make my wife Eleanor want to sit out on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea and watch the fireflies come up out of the grass. She'd been gone 14 months by then, and I still hadn't figured out how to sit on that porch without her. We were at Delmonico's, the good steakhouse downtown in Charlotte, North Carolina, the one with the white tablecloths and the wine list thicker than a phone book. I was paying, same as always. The dinner was supposed to honor Eleanor on what would have been her 65th birthday. She was the reason Ashford Precision existed at all. She'd cashed in her own savings bond, the one her grandmother left her, so I could buy my first lathe machine when the bank turned me down flat. We built that company together out of nothing but stubbornness and second mortgages, and by the time she passed, it was worth better than $31 million. Sitting across from me that night was my son, Marcus, 38 years old, who I had made president of the company exactly 18 months earlier when my knees finally told me it was time to step back into the chairman's chair. Beside him was his wife, Kayla, a woman who used to sell timeshares down in Myrtle Beach before she married into money and decided she'd been born to a country club all along. She was working her way through a glass of Bordeaux that cost more than my first week's wages ever did, looking at her phone more than she looked at either of us. The restaurant was soft and golden, candles flickering, a piano somewhere playing something low and easy, but our table had a chill to it that no candle was going to fix. Marcus had been distant for months, short with me on calls, dismissive in meetings, quick to remind everyone that he was the one running things now. I told myself it was the stress of the job. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong long before I let myself admit it. When the waiter cleared the plates and poured the last of the wine, I decided it was time to share something I'd been carrying close to my chest all week. Something that had brought me a small piece of peace during a hard season of missing my wife. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my checkbook, the same worn leather one I'd carried for 20 years, and set it down gently on the tablecloth. I looked at my son and searched his face for some trace of his mother. "I've been thinking about your mom all week," I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "You remember how she used to volunteer down at the Second Chance Veterans Shelter on Freedom Drive? That building's been falling apart for years, leaking roof, busted furnace, the whole thing. Your mother always said if we ever had the money to spare, that's where it should go. So tonight, in her memory, I'm writing a check for $40,000 to get that shelter fixed up before winter." I expected a nod. I expected, maybe, a soft word about his mother, a shared moment of grief between a father and a son who had buried the same woman. Instead, what I got was instant, and it was ugly. Marcus set down his fork so hard it rang against the china. "Are you kidding me right now?" His voice wasn't loud yet, but it had an edge I'd never heard from him before, not once in 38 years. "You're going to sit here and give away 40 grand to a homeless shelter while I'm out there fighting to keep this company competitive? Dad, you don't get to just throw money around anymore. That's not just yours to burn." A couple at the next table turned their heads. Kayla's hand went to his forearm, but her eyes were on the room, not on him. "Not just mine," I repeated, very quietly. "You know what I mean," Marcus snapped, leaning in now, his face reddening under the candlelight. "You handed me this company because you said you trusted me to run it. Well, running it means making smart decisions, and writing checks to shelters for people who won't ever thank you isn't smart. It's embarrassing. You're embarrassing yourself, Dad. People talk. The board talks. I hear it. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand or my voice. I sat there in dead silence, staring at a stranger wearing my son's face, and something inside my chest went very still and very cold. Embarrassing. My money, the money I bled for over 4 decades of 16-hour days in a machine shop that smelled like cutting oil and burnt steel, was somehow an embarrassment when I chose to spend it on the woman who made every bit of it possible. The whole table went quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a room hold its breath waiting for the older man to blow up and make a scene. I am not that kind of man. I never have been. I slid my checkbook back into my jacket pocket, laid $200 bills down to cover the meal, and stood up slow and straight. I did not say another word. I turned and walked out through those heavy oak doors into the warm Carolina night, and by the time I reached my truck in the parking lot, I already knew, without one shred of doubt, that the war for the rest of my life had just quietly begun. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, same as I have every day since I was 22 years old running a machine shop floor. Old habits don't die, not even when the reason for them is long gone. The house was quiet, too quiet, the way it's been quiet since Eleanor passed. It's a big brick colonial out in the Providence Plantation neighborhood that she and I bought back in the 90s, and without her in it, some mornings it feels less like a home and more like a museum nobody visits. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen counter, watching the sun come up gray and slow through the window, replaying Marcus's words in my head. Embarrassing. That word sat in my stomach like a stone. Around 8:30, there was a knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting anybody. I opened it to find Marcus and Kayla standing on my porch, holding a fruit basket wrapped in cellophane with a ridiculous gold bow on it, the kind of thing you buy at a gas station on your way to apologize for something you don't actually feel sorry about. Marcus looked rough, pale, hungover, like he hadn't slept. "Dad," he said, his voice smaller than it had been the night before. "Can we come in? We need to talk to you." Every instinct I had, the same instincts that had carried Ashford Precision through 2 recessions and a supplier bankruptcy that nearly sank us in 2009, told me to shut that door. But a man doesn't survive 40 years in manufacturing contracts by refusing to hear an offer out first. I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the living room, the one Eleanor decorated herself, all soft blues and family photographs. I took my chair by the window. They sat close together on the sofa like 2 kids called into a principal's office. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't offer them anything. I just folded my hands and waited, because in every negotiation I ever sat through, the man who speaks first is usually the man who loses. Marcus cracked first, same as he always does. "Dad, I am so sorry about last night. I was out of line. The stress of running this place is eating me alive. We've got that Raleigh expansion falling behind schedule. Supplier costs are through the roof, and I haven't slept right in weeks. I had too much scotch, and I said something I didn't mean. That's not who I am." I sat there and let him talk, watching him blame the alcohol, blame the company, blame everything except the plain fact that he'd looked his own father in the eye and called him an embarrassment. Before I could respond, Kayla leaned forward and put a soft hand on his knee, looking at me with an expression practiced enough to be believable to anyone who hadn't known her for 11 years. "It's the truth, Robert," she said, her voice honeyed and careful. "Marcus has been working himself half to death trying to make you proud. But honestly, we've both been worried about you. You've been alone in this big house for over a year now. Grief plays tricks on a person's judgment." "Worried about me?" I said flatly. "Yes," she went on smoothly. "You're a generous man. Robert, sometimes too generous. There's so much fraud out there targeting older folks who've lost a spouse. People take advantage of grief, of loneliness. When you pulled out that checkbook last night for $40,000, Marcus panicked because he's scared someone's going to take advantage of you. That's why we already went ahead and set up a family trust this week just to protect your assets while you're grieving. It's a standard thing, Robert. Lots of families with your kind of wealth do it." I nodded slowly, softening my face the way you soften a face when you're pretending to believe a lie you can already smell rotting. But underneath, every business instinct I'd sharpened over 4 decades was screaming one word at me: cage. That phrase, family trust, sounded a whole lot less like protection and a whole lot more like a legal door swinging shut behind me. After they finally left, the fruit basket forgotten on the counter, I needed air. I went out to the garage and pulled the tarp off my old 1985 Chevy pickup, the very first vehicle I ever bought outright with cash from the shop, back before any of the money, before the contracts, before any of this. I drove it out toward the edge of town to a little independent garage run by a man named Elias, who I'd known since he was fixing my delivery trucks 30 years ago. I'd scheduled a simple oil change, nothing more. It was good to talk to a man who worked with his hands and had no hidden angle in the world. When it was done, Elias rang me up $85, nothing to a man in my position. I handed him my black card, the private wealth account with no real limit. the one holding decades of savings completely separate from company finances. He swiped it. It declined. He swiped it again. Same sharp beep. "Sorry, Robert," he said quietly, embarrassed on my behalf. Card's saying no. I stood there, not understanding. I had millions sitting in that account. I told him it was probably a fraud flag, stepped outside, and called my personal banker, a man named Gerald who'd handled my portfolio for 15 years and who normally picked up on the first ring like I was doing him a favor. This time it rang 6 times before he answered, and the moment he spoke, I knew something was wrong. His voice was thin and frightened. "Robert," he said, "I'm so sorry. I can't release the hold. I don't have the legal authority anymore. It's my money, Gerald. What are you talking about? Your son came in first thing this morning with 2 attorneys and a court order. Robert, it's a conservatorship. A judge signed off on it late last night. Marcus has been granted emergency control of your accounts, effective immediately." The warm Carolina morning turned cold around me in an instant. A conservatorship. I am a sound man. My mind is sharper now than it's ever been. The plausible little lie from that morning shattered into pieces right in front of me. This had never been about protecting me from scammers. It was about locking me out of my own life while my son and his wife quietly picked it clean. I did not scream. I did not curse the sky. I climbed back into my old Chevy, gripped the wheel, and drove straight downtown toward the Ashford Precision headquarters, the building I had personally poured the foundation money into 22 years ago. I knew every hallway, every access panel, every inch of that place. But driving up on it that morning, it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like enemy territory. I parked in the public garage instead of my reserved spot and walked in through the front lobby like any other visitor. Nobody looks twice at a gray-haired man in a windbreaker. I went straight for the private executive elevator and held up my founder's badge, the one that had opened every locked door in that building for 2 decades. The scanner blinked red. Access denied. I tried it again. Same red light, same cold little beep, mocking me. He hadn't just frozen my bank accounts, he'd erased me from my own company's system entirely. I stepped back, calm, and leaned against the marble wall like a man waiting on an appointment. After a few minutes, a young intern came through juggling a stack of boxes and a badge he couldn't quite manage to scan while holding 4 coffees. I slipped in right behind him as the doors opened. "Don't worry about it, son," I told him gently, steadying his top box. "Left my badge upstairs. Mind hitting the executive floor for me?" He did, without a second thought. The doors slid shut and carried me up into what used to be my own kingdom. On the top floor, I walked quiet and slow, past the framed photos of jobs we'd done for Lockheed and Boeing over the years, jobs I was there for personally, and I stopped outside the old finance office. Through the half-closed blinds, I saw Kayla, a woman with no title, no degree, no business sitting behind that desk at all, leaning back in the leather chair with a brand-new diamond bracelet on her wrist, signing paperwork stamped with the company letterhead, property transfer documents. She was quietly liquidating the Gastonia warehouse and 2 of our distribution lots, turning steel and concrete into cash that would never see a board meeting. My chest went hot, but my head stayed ice cold. I didn't open that door. Walking in with nothing but anger would have been noise, and noise wasn't going to save what was left of my life's work. I memorized every paper on that desk and walked back out the way I came. I drove clear out past the city limits to a small diner off Highway 74, the kind of place with burnt coffee and a jukebox nobody plays anymore. In the back booth, nursing black coffee, same as always, sat Walter Higgins, my old attorney, retired now, who'd fought off 3 hostile buyout attempts for me back in the 80s and 90s, and never once lost his nerve doing it. "You look like a man who just watched his own funeral," Walter said, not even looking up from his coffee. I told him everything: the dinner, the fruit basket, the family trust, the declined card, the conservatorship, and finally Kayla sitting in my old CFO's chair signing away my warehouses. Walter set his mug down slow and heavy. "A conservatorship," he said, shaking his head. "That's the nuclear option, Robert. They didn't just freeze your checking account. They told a judge you're not fit to run your own life anymore. Can they actually make that stick? Not if we move faster than they think you can," Walter said, and for the first time in 2 days, something in my chest loosened, just slightly. "You didn't build this company by being slow, Robert. Time to remember that." Over the next several days, Walter and I worked quietly, out of sight, using cash and an old business partner's spare office instead of anything with my name attached to it. I still had assets Marcus didn't know existed. A private holding account set up 11 years ago under Eleanor's maiden name for tax purposes, one that had never been folded into the conservatorship filing because nobody but Walter and my late wife's old estate attorney even remembered it existed. It wasn't a fortune compared to the company, but it was untouched, and it was enough to move quickly and quietly. We also found something Marcus never expected us to find. Buried in an old company laptop I still had access to through a backup drive Eleanor had insisted we keep years ago, there were emails between Marcus and a supplier in Charlotte, showing he'd been quietly overbilling two of our biggest aerospace contracts and funneling the difference into a private account, all while telling the board our margins were shrinking because of rising material costs. He hadn't just betrayed his father. He'd been stealing from the company itself for the better part of a year, and Kayla's diamond bracelet and Bordeaux habit weren't coming from a president's salary alone. Walter filed an emergency motion challenging the conservatorship, citing my full mental competency confirmed by two independent physicians, and quietly alerted the company's outside auditor to irregularities in the aerospace contract billing without naming me at all, just enough of a professional tip to trigger a review that state law required them to escalate. 2 weeks after that dinner at Delmonico's, while Marcus and Kayla were still congratulating themselves on locking an old man out of his own fortune, the wheels I'd set turning were already grinding toward them, slow and patient and completely out of their sight. On a warm Tuesday morning, I drove back to the house one last time. Marcus and Kayla weren't there, they were at the office, unaware that a judge had already lifted the conservatorship the previous afternoon based on Walter's motion and 2 medical evaluations that found me sharper than most 40-year-olds. I let myself into my own home with my own key, packed a single duffel bag, and left something behind on the kitchen counter for them to find. I set out copies of the overbilling emails, a printed notice that the conservatorship had been formally dissolved, and beneath it, a short note in my own handwriting. I wrote, "You said I was an embarrassment. Ask the board what they think you are." I left the note squarely in the center of the counter where the fruit basket had sat 2 weeks earlier. Then I walked out, locked the door behind me, and drove away in my old Chevy without looking back once. I merged onto I-77 heading south, windows down, the warm June air pouring through the cab. I had signed over my chairman title the day before, effective immediately, transferring my remaining shares into a trust that would keep the company alive for its 300 employees but permanently and irrevocably out of Marcus's control. Placed instead under professional management, the board itself had already begun vetting. I hadn't taken a dime that wasn't rightfully mine. I hadn't broken a single law. I had simply, quietly, made sure the truth reached the people who needed to see it, and let the consequences move exactly as fast as the truth deserved to move. Somewhere past Rock Hill, a burner phone I'd bought with cash 3 days earlier rang from the passenger seat. I answered it without a word. "Dad, what did you do?" Marcus's voice cracked through the speaker, high and frantic. Nothing at all like the man who'd called me an embarrassment 2 weeks before. "The board just voted me out. They're saying there's an SEC referral. Kayla's freezing out. Dad, our accounts are locked. Everything's locked. You have to fix this." I kept my eyes on the road ahead of me, the asphalt running long and clean and open toward South Carolina, toward the ocean, toward a life that finally belonged only to me. "You told me I was an embarrassment for spending my own money on your mother's memory," I said, calm and even, letting every word land exactly where it needed to. "I heard you. I stopped embarrassing you, son. I stepped aside completely, just like you always wanted. Enjoy explaining the rest to your lawyers." I ended the call, rolled down the window the rest of the way, and let the wind take the sound of his voice clean out of the cab. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. I felt clean. I felt like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd been carrying since long before that dinner. Maybe since the day he handed his son a company and mistook obedience for respect. I drove until the pine trees gave way to salt air, until I found a quiet stretch of coastline near Pawleys Island, where nobody knew the name Ashford at all, and I sat on a porch that wasn't nearly as grand as the one back home, and I finally let myself grieve for Eleanor the way I hadn't been able to in that big, empty house. She would have told me this was coming long before I let myself see it. She always did see people clearer than I did. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry away from my story, friend, it's this. The love you pour into your children is never wasted. But blind trust is a different thing entirely, and it is a debt that gets called due eventually, one way or another. Watch closely who thanks you and who simply expects you. A legacy isn't measured by how much money you leave behind for people who never valued it. It's measured by whether you kept your dignity intact right up until the very last dollar and the very last breath. Love your children with your whole heart, but never let that love blind you to what they've become. And if the day ever comes when your own flesh and blood looks you in the eye and calls you an embarrassment, don't shout, don't beg, and don't hand them one more thing to take for granted. Just quietly, calmly, start protecting yourself, because respect that has to be extorted was never respect to begin with, and the people who truly love you will never once ask you to prove you're still worth loving.